So I think we have Maurizio, Shoshana, and Judith. Nope, you need a break. You can do it on your own time. Or on this time out. Oh, no brainer. Perfect.
Okay then.
Are you joining them, Maurizio? You don't have to. I was just curious. I thought you were going to. Oh, come on up. Just come on up. It'll go quicker.
That ought to make you go quicker.
We're running. I took too much time on the last one for you, so I'm trying to get you going. Thank you.
All right, well, thanks. I'm going to start. I'm Shoshana Cohen with the Portland Bureau of Transportation. Mauricio may also jump in here, also with PBOT. And Judith Gray from ODOT is really you're going to hear from her during the bulk of the presentation. She's going to talk specifically about ODOT's value pricing project that they are in the process of doing right now. We just want to take a few minutes, and I'll try to be even a little briefer than I was planning on, to just sort of set the stage a little bit about why the city has an interest in exploring congestion pricing, why we think congestion is a problem, and sort of how we are beginning to sort of analyze and evaluate what ODOT is doing as we get started. And one super quick note, the city is using the terms congestion pricing, ODOT is using the term value pricing. We're talking about the same thing, a new tool, and we're figuring out sort of what to call it. So. Just trying to confuse everyone a little more.
What about robbing the public?
So you all know Portland is growing. The region is expecting to add about 500,000 new residents by 2040. And as we grow in population, congestion is growing. That makes travel times unreliable. And it really brings with it a huge host of problems. And that's one of the reasons, or the main reason, that we are really thinking that we need a new sort of tool to address these problems. Congestion brings with it economic costs to businesses, costs to families for fuel, for vehicle maintenance, for lost time. It brings with it health costs, emissions, long commutes contribute to asthma, heart disease, other health problems. There are very real climate problems. 40% of Oregon's greenhouse gas emissions are currently from motor vehicles. And there are very real equity costs. Basically, all of these costs are exacerbated. Lower income communities and communities of color often live closer to freeways and farther from work. In Portland in particular, as you all know, housing costs are rising, and we are pushing people farther and farther out, causing them to have longer commutes and then spend more of their money, spend more time away. And basically, there is already sort of a hidden congestion tax, which we're not talking about, but this exists in our transportation system as it is right now, and that's sort of what we're trying to sort of solve for. Again, you are all probably pretty aware of this, but we have a whole suite of tools, current strategies for congestion relief. We look to provide alternatives to single occupancy vehicle trips, transit, carpools, biking, walking. We have land use strategies where we encourage housing that's close to employment centers and walkable, bikeable neighborhoods with good access to transit. We're also working on influencing people's transportation choices through transportation demand management strategies, working with businesses to give their employees incentives to ride transit or bike to work. And we have projects that improve signal synchronization and work on improving traffic flow. Again, we have a bunch of strategies, and they're working. We're making progress, but we are also seeing that we need to do more. The region is currently in the process of updating our regional transportation plan, our transportation investment strategy through 2040, for the next 25 years. And through this very up-to-date current planning process, we're really sort of getting a pretty clear snapshot that we need more tools. By 2027, we're showing that even with all of the projected investments over the next 10 years, about a third of the region's freeways are expected to be congested or severely congested at that point. Another metric we are looking at is truck vehicle hours of delay, which are also expected to grow by up to 120% between the 2015 levels and 2027. So we have strategies, we're working on congestion relief, but we really need to do more, which is why we think that pricing of some sort might be a new complementary tool that could help with our solve for congestion. So even though we're calling it a couple different things, what are we really talking about? Congestion or value pricing is a method of charging a fee for road use, which more accurately reflects the demand for the use of the road. And when demand for the road is high, during congested times, the fee is then higher.
What about disabled and elderly and stuff that can't afford it? What about the streets?
Excuse me, sir, this is a briefing. If you could keep it quiet, we appreciate it. Thank you.
So the goal is that these fees will encourage people to make different choices, to carpool, to use transit, to use biking and walking, or to travel at different times. And of course, it is very important that we need to have these alternatives available. We can't charge fees, encourage people to use transit if transit isn't available. So this has to be sort of part of a whole suite of tools to make the system work better and ultimately reduce discretionary trips in single occupancy vehicles. One of the sort of pieces that we're looking super closely at is that the revenue then that is generated, we would hope some of it would be used to support these other transportation choices. It could also be used to add capacity. And just one sort of way of thinking about it is it's similar in some ways to peak pricing. We're already seeing being done by transportation network companies like Uber and Lyft, but we're hoping to use the additional pricing to actually manage and reduce congestion, not just profit from it as sort of the private companies that are working on this are doing so far. I wanted to sort of make sure that you all are up to speed on, because of the promise of congestion pricing as a general tool. Council a couple months ago in November of 2017 brought a resolution which did a couple of things, but one of them was that they directed PBOT to work with the Oregon State Legislature, to work with ODOT on the Oregon State Legislature's requirements, which again Judith will get into the details on in a minute, but to work on the plan for value pricing on I-5 and I-205 with a very clear focus on the outcome being demand management, as well as making sure that we are looking at the impacts of climate and equity, responsible use of the revenue, and diversion on our neighborhood streets. So this is the work that we are sort of engaged in at this moment. And what that means, again, as I turn it over to Judith in a minute, as we are evaluating the specific proposals, which you'll hear about, we are really looking, and we want you to know as you hear about them, but our approach is to evaluate the different options, looking for those that provide the greatest and most cost-effective outcomes for congestion relief, again, while carefully considering equity, climate, and safety impacts. One other thing that you'll hear as Judith gets more into the details of the timeline, this process is at the very beginning. It started in November, and there's a process right now with a advisory committee that's running through June that's going to be making an initial recommendation. And one of the things as we've been participating in ODOT's process is we're realizing there are a huge amount of unanswered questions. We're seeing some modeling. It's showing some things about vehicle delay and congestion outcomes. It's showing some things about diversion. It's not going to fully answer, all of the details we are very interested in about diversion on our local streets. It's not going to fully answer all of the equity questions that we have and how we can provide full benefits and make sure there are not additional burdens. There's a whole host of questions that this initial stage isn't going to answer. That said, we do think that there's the potential for this process, to really come up with some potentially transformational changes to our system. And we would like to see a recommendation to move forward to the next stage, to what would most likely be a NEPA process over years, to continue to study sort of the most full option where there would be tolling on all lanes of I-5 and I-205 sort of throughout the full study area. And again, you'll see that in a minute. But that seems like there's potentially the most benefit if implemented correctly, and we'd like to see that advance for study. And because we'll be sort of putting some faith that we want to see it advance for study without answering all the questions, the approach we're sort of thinking about right now is to develop just some principles for moving it forward. Basically, as we move forward with this process, principles around safety. The ultimate solution cannot make our streets less safe, either within the specific project areas or through diversion on our local network. But we would also want to make sure that the project, ultimately, the elements and the revenue use must really make the system more equitable. And around climate, again, we're seeing some analysis. We're hoping greenhouse gas reductions, air particulates, but ultimately we would want to be very clear that there's evidence that the project would have an overall benefit on the environment. And then as far as revenue use, basically we'll be looking for the revenue, at least some of the revenue, to sort of contribute towards those outcomes and help to make the transportation system, help to make sure there are enough alternatives and make the system safer. Examples would be investment in transit or biking and walking or safety on local arterials and low-income user discounts. And that's really sort of the framing that we just wanted to give. Before I hand it over to Judith, just the last point that it seems worth saying specifically around transit, that we are, I think, in a lot of the initial conversations, transit and robust alternatives is going to be key to making a system work. Both here and in other places, transit seems to be a very important alternative if you're going to price. And there's already discussions. There are limits within the Oregon Constitution for funds that can be used from the highway fund. It is also important to note, though, that you could support transit with revenues. You could support transit capital, for instance, to work on enhanced transit and put capital access to transit improvements. You can't, as it exists right now, use funds from in the highway constitutionally restricted area towards transit operations. But it also, there may be a discussion about even going further and seeing if there's a way to use toll funds to more sort of directly towards transit, which is just sort of an emerging thing. It seems worth seeding right now. And with that, I will turn it over to Judith.
I think you can stay, and I could just move this.
It was on the desktop, so
I can't see.
I think I have to close mine. You have to close mine.
This one?
Yeah.
So again, I'm Judith Gray. Last time I was here, I was working in the planning section at PBOT. And in October, I moved to ODOT specifically to manage this project. So it's nice to be back. I like your new digs.
We do too.
Yeah, good. So Shoshana did a great overview, and I think I'll be able to just reference some of her remarks rather than go through them again. I want to provide a little bit of a background about the process, what we're doing with public engagement, and how we're approaching the technical analysis, and then a little bit of next steps. But I have a new hobby. My new hobby is to look on Google Maps and get directions and estimated travel times for different origins and destination pairs. This is the first one when I realized I should start doing this more often. When I had an open house in Vancouver, and I needed to arrive at 5 o'clock the next week. So, a lot of us use Google Maps to find out how long it's going to take me if I leave right now to get from point A to point B and what my route should be. But it'll also give you an estimated departure time for the future. So I have all these different ODOT pairs, that's what we call it, origin destination pairs, that I've saved for 11 o'clock at night versus 5:30 next Thursday. Because this is the problem. To get from the ODOT office in Old Town to the Vancouver Library and arrive at 5:30 p.m. on a Thursday, I should expect my travel time to be between 28 minutes and 1 hour and 10 minutes. I also did this from Beaverton to the Portland Airport when I was on the west side of the West Side Transportation Alliance. Beaverton to the Portland Airport, 40 minutes to 1 hour and 40 minutes. That's a problem. Because not only is it congested, and those travel times might be something like 30 minutes, and so you're already bumping up just at the low end But it's that variability that I think is the huge impact to business and to individuals. And we're going to talk about equity, and equity is one of the most important considerations. But one thing I know, people who have low-wage jobs, people who have low incomes, also value their time and may have less flexibility. So this isn't good enough. So that's really one of the opportunities, I think, to try to, where congestion pricing could help us to manage, at least in that variability, that unpredictability of a trip. I think that most of you are familiar with House Bill 2017 from last year's legislative session, where the legislature took a big move toward transportation investments, not only in some major freeway projects, but also making the Connect Oregon project for multimodal projects, freight projects, rest areas.